Roman didn't bring his secretary to the blood money gala because he liked her. He brought her because she wore scuffed orthotic loafers, flinched at sudden noises, and was the walking opposite of the plastic syndicate wives parading around the ballroom. It was supposed to be a joke, a giant middle finger to the family's obsession with appearances. But when Chloe stepped into the chandelier light, the joke died in his throat. Every man in the room stopped breathing, and Roman realized he'd made a catastrophic mistake. The 64th floor of the Castellani building smelled of ozone, espresso, and suppressed panic. Chloe Hayes operated within that panic like a deep-sea diver accustomed to crushing pressure. She was 26, hopelessly indebted to a defunct art school, and currently employed as the executive assistant to a man who technically did not exist on any legitimate payroll in the city. Roman Castor was a ghost who bled people dry. He ran the shipping routes, the unions, and the quiet, violent disputes that kept the eastern seaboard running. He was also, at this precise moment, staring out the floor-to-ceiling window of his office with a look of profound, terrifying boredom. Chloe set a ceramic mug on his desk. She didn't let the bottom scrape the mahogany. She knew exactly how he liked it. Black, scalding, poured exactly 4 minutes after the beans were ground. "The Valenti meeting is moved to 3, Chloe said, her voice a low, steady hum. She kept her eyes on her tablet. She always kept her eyes on her tablet or the floor, or the hem of her oversized, aggressively beige cardigan. Roman didn't turn around. His suit was charcoal, tailored to fit the broad, dense line of his shoulders. "Cancel it. They've been waiting for 3 weeks, Mr. Castor." "Cancel it, Chloe." She tapped the screen. Cancelled. Roman finally turned. He was a brutally handsome man, with a jawline that looked like it had been carved from something unyielding, and eyes the color of a winter ocean. He didn't look at Chloe like she was a woman. He looked at her like she was a highly functional piece of office equipment, a reliable printer, a very quiet fax machine. For 2 years, Chloe had been the invisible engine of his day. She hid her figure beneath shapeless wool and sensible skirts. She pulled her hair back into a bun so tight it gave her chronic migraines. She did this deliberately. In a world populated by men who took whatever they wanted, the safest thing a woman could be was uninteresting. Roman picked up the coffee. He took a sip. Perfect, as always. His gaze drifted to the heavy, gold-embossed envelope sitting on the edge of his desk. The annual Syndicate Gala. A mandatory gathering of the city's worst monsters, all dressed in tuxedos, pretending to be civilized philanthropists. "The gala is tomorrow," Roman said. His voice was gravel and smoke. "I have your tuxedo pressed and waiting at the penthouse. The car is scheduled for 7, Chloe replied, already backing toward the door. "The invitation says +1. I can arrange an escort from the usual agency, Mr. Castor. Should I request blonde or brunette?" Roman stared at her, really stared at her. He took in the fraying edges of her beige sweater, the thick, tortoiseshell glasses that constantly slid down her nose, the posture that screamed, "Please do not perceive me." The families expected him to show up with a supermodel on his arm, a tall, empty-eyed creature draped in diamonds, just like the rest of them. It was a pissing contest. Who had the most power, the most money, the most beautiful, silent ornament? Roman despised them. He despised the pretense. A dark, cynical thought took root in his brain. What if he brought the fax machine? What if he walked into the ballroom with a woman wearing orthotic loafers and a sweater that smelled like mothballs? The insult to the old bosses would be astronomical. It would be a blatant mockery of their traditions, a statement that Roman Castor didn't need to play their pathetic games to hold their respect. "Cancel the agency," Roman said. Chloe paused, her hand hovering over the brass doorknob. "Sir?" "You're going with me." The silence in the office became absolute. Chloe felt a cold spike of adrenaline punch through her stomach. She finally looked up, her brown eyes wide behind the thick lenses. I don't understand." "It's an event. I need a +1. You're my assistant. Consider it over time." "Mr. Castor, I am not. I don't go to galas. I don't own clothes for galas." I answer phones and manage the itinerary." Her voice was starting to shake. She clamped her jaw shut to stop it. "A box will be delivered to your apartment tomorrow at noon. The car will pick you up at 6. Man sat down at his desk, pulling a stack of manifests toward him. The conversation was over. "Mr. Castor, please." "I can't." Roman didn't look up. "If you aren't in the car at 6, Chloe, don't bother coming in on Monday." It was a threat. A quiet, devastating threat. The health insurance from this job paid for her mother's dialysis. He didn't know that, of course. He didn't know anything about her outside of these walls. But he knew she needed the money. Chloe swallowed the lump of panic in her throat. She gripped the doorknob. 6 o'clock, she whispered, and slipped out of the room. Roman listened to the soft click of the door closing. He permitted himself a small, grim smile. The look on the Don's face tomorrow night was going to be priceless. The box that arrived at Chloe's cramped 4th-floor walk-up was massive, matte black, and tied with a silk ribbon. The courier, a terrifyingly large man with a scar running through his eyebrow, simply handed it to her, grunted, and walked down the stairs. Chloe stared at the box on her futon for an hour before opening it. She expected something decent. A modest evening gown, a pantsuit maybe. When she lifted the tissue paper, her breath hitched. It was a dress, but calling it a dress felt like calling a switchblade a knife. It was an aggressive liquid slip of midnight blue silk. It was backless. It had a slit that ran dangerously high up the thigh. Beneath the dress sat a pair of black stiletto heels with a red sole, a velvet box containing a simple, blinding diamond choker, and a note written in Roman's jagged scrawl. "Put it on." Panic, cold and sharp, flooded her veins. She couldn't wear this. This was a dress designed to draw eyes, to demand attention. It went against every survival instinct she had honed over the last 2 years. She held the silk up to the light. It weighed practically nothing. She had no choice. Dialysis, the rent, the crushing reality of her life. She spent the next 3 hours in a state of dissociative dread. She took down her severe bun, washing and drying her hair until it fell in heavy, loose waves down her back. She applied the minimal makeup she owned, focusing on a dark, red lip she usually reserved for funerals. When she slipped the dress on, she stood in front of the cracked mirror in her bathroom and didn't recognize the woman staring back. The shapeless sweaters had done their job too well. They had hidden the fact that underneath the wool, she had the soft, curved architecture of a Renaissance painting. The silk clung to her hips, dipped dangerously low at her lower back, and framed her pale skin against the midnight blue. Without the heavy glasses, she had forced herself to put in contacts that burned her eyes. Her face was striking, not artificially perfect, but arresting. Real. She hated it. She felt completely, utterly naked. At exactly 6 o'clock, a horn honked on the street below. The ride to the estate was suffocating. Roman sat on the opposite side of the Maybach, scrolling through his phone. When she had climbed into the car, he hadn't even looked up. He merely registered her presence and tapped the glass divider to signal the driver. He was treating her exactly as he always did. She was an accessory to the evening, a punchline to a joke she didn't fully understand. She kept her hands folded tightly in her lap, praying she wouldn't sweat through the silk. The car slowed as they approached the sprawling, gated mansion. Valets in crisp white jackets rushed forward. "Stay close," Roman said, pocketing his phone. It was the first thing he had said to her in 40 minutes. "Don't speak to anyone unless I introduce you. Keep your head down." "Yes, Mr. Castor." The door opened. Roman stepped out first, adjusting the cuffs of his tuxedo. He looked like violence barely contained in bespoke wool. He turned and offered his hand. Chloe took it. His skin was warm, his grip entirely impersonal. She stepped out of the car, her heels clicking against the cobblestone. The cool night air hit her bare back, and she shivered. They walked up the sweeping marble staircase toward the grand entrance. The heavy mahogany doors were open, spilling golden light and the sound of a string quartet into the night. Roman was already preparing his smirk. He was ready for the confused glances. He was ready for the whispered insults from men who thought a woman's only value was her plastic surgery bill. He pulled Chloe slightly forward, stepping through the doorway and into the ballroom. The room was packed with the most dangerous men in the country, bosses, underbosses, enforcers. They stood in clusters, smoking cigars, holding crystal glasses of scotch, their wives draped in heavy, garish jewelry beside them. The maître d' announced them. Mr. Roman Castor, and guest. Roman walked down the 3 shallow steps into the main room, dragging Chloe alongside him. He waited for the sneers. He waited for the joke to land. But the room didn't sneer. The room went dead silent. It started near the door. A couple from the west side stopped mid-sentence, his glass halting halfway to his mouth. He was staring at Chloe. Then it spread. The laughter died out. The string quartet seemed to falter for a fraction of a second as the cellist lost his place. Heads turned. Eyes locked onto the woman by Roman's side. They weren't looking at her with confusion. They were looking at her with an intense, predatory hunger. Chloe kept her eyes glued to the floor, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She felt the weight of 100 stares pressing into her skin. Roman stopped walking. The smirk he had prepared vanished, replaced by a sudden, jarring spike of confusion. He finally looked at the men around him. He saw the way the Don's son was tracking the curve of Chloe's spine. He saw the way a rival boss was staring at her mouth. Slowly, Roman turned his head to look at his secretary. He looked at her. Really looked at her. For the first time in 2 years. He saw the midnight blue silk moulding to curves he hadn't known existed. He saw the pale, elegant slope of her neck, the cascade of dark hair, the sharp, terrified beauty in her dark eyes as she briefly glanced up at him. She wasn't a joke. She was a revelation. And every single man in this room wanted her. A heavy, dark sensation slammed into Roman's chest. It wasn't amusement. It was rage. Pure, territorial, violent rage. The joke was over. And Roman Castor suddenly realized he had just dragged something incredibly precious into a room full of starving wolves. The silence in the ballroom didn't last. It fractured into a low, buzzing murmur that felt heavier than the quiet. Roman's hand, which had been resting loosely near his side, snapped to the small of Chloe's back. His fingers splayed across her bare skin. His palm was burning hot. The touch wasn't polite or guiding. It was a physical barrier, a brand. "Keep your eyes on the floor," Roman ordered. His voice was barely a whisper, pitched so low it vibrated against her shoulder. "You told me to." Chloe breathed back, her voice shaking. "Do it harder." He steered her through the crowd. Men who usually greeted Roman with loud, booming voices and aggressive handshakes simply nodded, their eyes sliding past his shoulder to track Chloe's movement. The air in the room was thick with expensive cologne, cigar smoke, and unfiltered adrenaline. Chloe felt like a piece of raw meat dropped into a dog run. She focused intensely on the marble tiles beneath her feet, praying the needle-thin heels Roman had bought her wouldn't snap. Every step was an agonizing display. The dress moved like water, clinging and releasing with every breath she took. She felt exposed to her very marrow. They reached the edge of the room, near a towering ice sculpture that wept cold water into a silver basin. Roman didn't let go of her waist. If anything, his grip tightened, pressing her hip flush against his thigh. It was highly inappropriate for an employer. Under normal circumstances, Chloe would have stepped away, cited a workplace boundary, and retreated to the safety of a spreadsheet. Here, surrounded by men with dead eyes and tailored suits, Roman's body was the only safe harbor in the room. She leaned into him, just a fraction of an inch. Roman felt the slight shift in her weight. The tension in his jaw ticked. "Roman, you made it." The voice was smooth, cultured, and laced with absolute poison. Chloe forced herself to look up. A man stood before them holding a flute of champagne. He was older than Roman, perhaps in his late 40s, with silver peppered through his dark hair and a smile that didn't reach his flat, pale eyes. "Dominic," Roman said. His tone was perfectly flat. "I wouldn't miss it." Dominic Russo ran the ports on the south side. He was a man who buried his mistakes in concrete and sent flowers to their grieving mothers. He didn't look at Roman. His pale eyes were entirely fixed on Chloe. He looked at her mouth, the line of her throat, the way the diamond choker rested against her collarbone. "You've been hiding things from us, Roman," Dominic said, his smile widening slightly. He took a deliberate step closer to Chloe. "I know every woman in your circle. I don't know this one. And I would certainly remember." He reached out, offering a hand to Chloe. The rings on his fingers were heavy, solid gold. "Dominic Russo, and you are?" Chloe's throat closed. She looked at the hand. She knew the rules of this world well enough from the invoices she paid and the meetings she scheduled. You did not insult a boss. You did not refuse a greeting. She began to lift a trembling hand. Roman's hand moved faster. He didn't shake Dominic's hand. He simply stepped in front of Chloe, blocking her from Dominic's line of sight entirely. The movement was smooth but carried the distinct, unmistakable threat of violence. "She's my guest, Dominic," Roman said. The gravel in his voice had turned into shards of glass. "Not an acquaintance." Dominic's hand hung in the air for a second. The insult was massive. To refuse an introduction, to block a don from addressing a woman, it was an act of extreme disrespect. The air between the two men dropped 10 degrees. Two of Dominic's men, standing a few feet away, subtly unbuttoned their suit jackets. Roman didn't flinch. He just stood there, a monolithic wall of charcoal wool and repressed fury staring Dominic down. Slowly, Dominic lowered his hand. He let out a dry, rattling laugh. "Very protective tonight, aren't we?" Dominic murmured. He took a sip of his champagne, his eyes darting to the sliver of Chloe he could still see behind Roman's broad shoulders. "Enjoy the evening, Roman. We'll talk business later." He turned and walked away, his men falling in step behind him. Roman didn't move until Dominic was lost in the crowd. When he finally turned back to Chloe, his eyes were storm dark. The winter ocean was gone, replaced by a churning, violent squall. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice harsh. Chloe nodded, wrapping her arms around her stomach. The silk offered no warmth. "Who was that?" "A dead man, if he looks at you like that again," Roman said, and meant it. The words hung between them, shocking in their naked brutality. Chloe stared at him, her chest rising and falling rapidly. This wasn't her boss. Her boss yelled about coffee temperatures and manifest delays. This man was a predator who had just bared his teeth to defend his territory. "I need a drink," Roman muttered, running a hand through his hair. He looked down at her, his gaze dropping to the swell of her chest, the pale column of her neck. He swallowed hard. "Stay exactly here. Do not move. If anyone speaks to you, ignore them. I'll be back in 30 seconds. Mr. Castor—" "Roman," he interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. "Tonight, my name is Roman." He turned and strode toward the bar, leaving a wake of nervous tension in his path. Chloe stood by the weeping ice sculpture, shivering in her beautiful, terrible dress, realizing with a sinking dread that the danger wasn't just the men in the room. The danger was the man she came with. The dining portion of the evening was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Roman had secured a table near the back, pulling out Chloe's chair with a stiff, rigid formality. He didn't sit across from her, he sat beside her. He positioned his chair so that his broad shoulders formed a physical barricade between Chloe and the rest of the room. Course after course arrived, seared scallops, truffled risotto, dry-aged steak, but Chloe couldn't eat. The heavy silver cutlery felt clumsy in her trembling hands. Every time she lifted her head, she caught someone staring. A capo across the room, a lieutenant by the doors. The syndicate wives, with their taut faces and glittering jewels, glared at her with undisguised venom. Roman noticed. He noticed every single glance. With every look cast her way, his posture grew stiffer. He drank his scotch straight, not bothering with the wine pairing. "Eat," he ordered quietly, pushing her plate of risotto an inch toward her. "I'm not hungry," she whispered. "You're shaking. Eat the food, Chloe." She picked up her fork and managed a single, tasteless bite. "Why did you bring me here?" she asked, keeping her voice low. The question had been burning a hole in her stomach for hours. Roman stared down at his glass. The amber liquid caught the light of the crystal chandeliers overhead. "I needed a +1. You could have hired someone. You usually do." "I didn't want to. So you bought a $10,000 dress for your secretary to parade her in front of a mafia summit. As what? A distraction?" She was surprised by her own bitterness. The fear was beginning to curdle into anger. Roman finally turned to look at her. His eyes swept over her face, stripping away the professional distance they had maintained for 2 years. "It was supposed to be a joke," he said, the honesty dragged out of him against his will. "A statement, to show them I don't care about their pageantry." Chloe shrank back. The words hit her like a physical blow. "A joke? You dress me up to mock them." "Yes. And me?" Roman leaned in closer, the smell of scotch and clean linen wrapped around her. "It isn't a joke anymore, Chloe." Before she could dissect the heavy, dangerous weight of that sentence, the orchestra switched from light dinner music to a slow, sweeping waltz. The tables began to clear as couples moved toward the polished oak dance floor in the center of the room. A shadow fell over their table. Arthur Penhaligon, an underboss for the Northern families, stood there. He was young, viciously handsome, and famous for his complete lack of conscience. "Castor," Arthur said smoothly, offering a brief nod. Then he turned his attention entirely to Chloe. His eyes dragged over her bare shoulders in a way that made her skin crawl. "Your guest is the only beautiful thing in this godforsaken room. Mind if I borrow her for a dance?" Custom dictated that Roman say yes. To refuse a dance at a syndicate gathering was an open declaration of hostility. It signaled an extreme lack of trust. Chloe froze. She looked at Roman, silently begging him to find a way out of this. Roman set his glass down. The click of the crystal against the table sounded like a gunshot. He stood up slowly, unfolding his frame to his full height. He was 2 inches taller than Arthur and significantly broader. "Yes," Roman said flatly. "I mind." Arthur's smile slipped. The pleasant mask vanished, revealing the cold-blooded killer underneath. "It's just a dance, Roman. Don't tell me you're getting sentimental." "Find someone else to step on your feet, Arthur. She doesn't dance." Arthur stared at him for a long, tense moment. He gauged the violence radiating from Roman, calculated the odds, and decided it wasn't worth drawing blood over a woman tonight. He offered a tight, mocking bow. "Pity. Have a good evening." Arthur walked away. The silence at the table was suffocating. Roman didn't sit back down. He reached out and grabbed Chloe's wrist. His grip was firm, hauling her out of her chair before she could protest. "What are you doing?" she gasped, stumbling as her high heels hit the floor. "If I keep refusing them, someone is going to pull a gun," Roman said grimly. "And I will kill them, and it will ruin my suit." He didn't give her a choice. He pulled her past the tables and directly into the center of the dance floor. He turned her around and pulled her against him. It was a shock to her system. Chloe had never been this close to him. At the office, they maintained a strict 3-foot radius. Now there was 0 distance. His arm banded around her waist, pulling her flush against his chest. Her hand was flattened against his shoulder. Feeling the hard, heavy muscle beneath the tailored wool, they began to move. Roman was a surprisingly graceful dancer, guiding her backward with absolute authority. Chloe couldn't look up. She stared at the knot of his black tie, her heart beating so hard it hurt. "Look at me," Roman commanded. She shook her head stubbornly. Roman's hand slid from her waist, dragging up the bare, sensitive skin of her spine until his fingers reached the nape of her neck. He threaded his fingers into the heavy waves of her dark hair and gently, but firmly, forced her head up. "Look at me," he repeated, softer this time. She met his eyes. They were burning. "Why do you do it?" Roman asked, his voice barely audible over the swelling music. "Do what?" "The sweaters, the ugly glasses, the hair pulled back so tight it makes you wince." He stepped closer, eliminating the last millimeter of space between them. "Why do you hide?" Chloe swallowed the knot in her throat. The heat of his body was overwhelming. The smell of him was everywhere. "You saw how they looked at me tonight," she whispered. "I saw. That's how men look at me, in the subway, on the street, in the coffee shop." Her voice cracked, a sliver of genuine, exhausted pain leaking out. "I don't have bodyguards, Mr. Castor. I don't have armor, the ugly clothes. They are my armor. They make me invisible. Invisible is safe." Roman stopped moving. Right in the middle of the dance floor, surrounded by the most dangerous people in the city, he stopped. He stared at her. He looked at the stark terror in her eyes, and then he realized the horrifying truth. She hadn't just been hiding from the men on the street. She had been hiding from him. A sick, heavy sensation twisted in Roman's gut. He was one of the monsters she needed armor against. He was the man who had ordered her into a silk dress and thrown her to the wolves for a laugh. "We're leaving," Roman said suddenly. "But the summit—" "I don't care." He dropped his hand from her neck and grabbed her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "We're leaving. Now." They didn't walk out of the ballroom. They cut through it like a blade. Roman kept his hand locked tightly around Chloe's, his stride long and punishing. He didn't offer apologies to the men he bumped into. He didn't acknowledge the Don, who was holding court by the main doors. The velvet ropes and heavy mahogany entryways simply parted for him, the guards stepping back in the face of the unadulterated menace radiating from his shoulders. Chloe practically had to jog to keep up, her ankles wobbling precariously on the stilettos. The cold night air hit her damp skin the second they cleared the vestibule. It felt like a slap. "Car!" Roman snapped at the valet captain. "Now!" The captain took one look at Roman's face and sprinted toward the lot. They stood under the massive stone portico. The silence between them was heavy, jagged, and uncomfortable. Chloe dropped his hand the moment they stopped moving, wrapping her arms around her own torso. The adrenaline that had carried her through the dining room was beginning to crash, leaving a hollow, freezing exhaustion in its place. Her teeth began to chatter. Roman watched her. He watched the way she instinctively curled inward, trying to make herself smaller, trying to disappear. He shrugged off his tuxedo jacket. The night air was biting, but he barely registered the drop in temperature. He stepped behind her and draped the heavy charcoal wool over her shoulders. Chloe flinched at the sudden contact. She gripped the lapels, pulling the jacket tight. It smelled of scotch, expensive dry cleaning, and the faint metallic scent of the city. It dwarfed her, the hem hitting halfway down her thighs, swallowing the midnight blue silk entirely. "Thank you," she mumbled, staring at the cobblestones. The black Maybach slid to a halt in front of them. Roman opened the rear door himself, bypassing the driver who had scrambled out to do it. He waited for Chloe to slide into the leather interior before getting in after her. The doors closed, sealing them in a quiet, temperature-controlled vault. "Take us back," Roman told the driver, rapping his knuckles against the glass partition. The car pulled away from the estate, leaving the glittering lights and the monsters behind. Chloe leaned her head against the cool window. She closed her eyes. The street lamps passing by cast rhythmic, strobing shadows across her face. She just wanted to go home. She wanted to scrub the makeup off, put on her oldest, ugliest flannel pajamas, and pretend none of this had ever happened. "What is your address?" Roman asked. His voice cut through the quiet, stripped of the gravelly edge it held in the ballroom. It sounded surprisingly tired. Chloe opened her eyes. "You don't have it." "HR has it. I don't." She recited the address of her walk-up in the outer boroughs, a neighborhood where the streetlights were mostly shattered and the police only drove through during daylight hours. Roman frowned in the darkness. No, no, I'm not taking you there. He reached forward and tapped the glass again. The penthouse. Chloe sat up, the heavy wool jacket slipping slightly off her shoulder. Mr. Castor, please. I just want to go home. I need to sleep. I have to call my mother in the morning. You can't go to that apartment tonight, Chloe. Why not? Roman turned his head to look at her. The ambient light from the dashboard illuminated the hard, unforgiving lines of his face. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He was looking at her with cold, logistical calculation. Because Dominic Russo saw you tonight, Roman said bluntly. Because Arthur Penhaligon asked you to dance. Because half the capos in that room spent the last 2 hours staring at your throat. I don't understand. We left. It's over. It's not over. It hasn't even started. Roman leaned back against the leather, rubbing a hand over his face. These men don't do well with the word no. They saw something they wanted. They saw me refuse them. In their world, that makes you a prize, a point of leverage. Chloe felt the blood drain from her face. The nausea she had been fighting all night returned, thick and choking. Leverage. I'm a secretary. I file your taxes. To them, you're the woman Roman Castor brought out of the shadows, the woman he threatened an underboss over. He let out a harsh, bitter exhale. If I drop you off at a 4th-floor walk-up with a broken security door, you won't be there by tomorrow morning. Someone will pick you up just to see what I'll do to get you back. The absolute certainty in his voice terrified her. He wasn't exaggerating to scare her. He was stating a simple geographical fact of his world. I can't afford this, Chloe whispered. The words slipped out before she could stop them. Her voice cracked, betraying the sheer weight of the panic crushing her chest. I have a mother who needs me. I have bills. I don't have the luxury of being a pawn in a mafia turf war. I just needed the paycheck. Roman looked at her. He saw the genuine, desperate terror in her eyes. It was a mirror reflecting his own colossal failure. He prided himself on control, on keeping his business contained, clean, and exact. Tonight, out of a petty desire to mock his rivals, he had taken a civilian, a woman who had spent 2 years quietly keeping his life in order, and painted a target on her back. He reached out. He didn't grab her wrist this time. He slowly, deliberately, laid his hand over hers where it rested on the leather seat. His palm was hot. I put the target there, Roman said, his voice dropping into a low, steady vow. I will make sure no one takes the shot. You are safe with me. Do you understand? Chloe looked down at his hand covering hers. It was a killer's hand, broad, calloused, capable of immense violence, and right now it was the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. She swallowed hard and nodded once. The rest of the drive was entirely silent, the city blurring past the tinted windows until the car finally descended into the secure, subterranean garage of the Castellani Tower. The penthouse occupied the entire 65th floor. It was a monument to wealth and paranoia. The elevator required a retinal scan. The walls were reinforced steel masked by imported Italian plaster, and the floor-to-ceiling windows were ballistic glass. It felt entirely sterile. There were no photographs, no books, no clutter, just sweeping expanses of slate, dark leather, and brushed steel. It was the home of a man who lived nowhere. Guest room is down the hall, second door on the left, Roman said, as the elevator doors slid shut behind them. He stripped off his tie, dropping it onto a heavy marble console table. There's an ensuite bathroom. The closet should have clean clothes. My housekeeper keeps basics stocked. Chloe stood in the foyer, still dwarfed by his suit jacket. She felt like a trespasser. Thank you. I'll make something to drink. Go. She went. The guest room was larger than her entire apartment. She locked the heavy door behind her, leaning against the wood for a long moment, waiting for her heart rate to finally slow down. When she stepped into the bathroom, she caught her reflection in the mirror. The red lipstick was smeared. Her hair was a wild, tangled mess from the wind. The expensive diamond choker felt like a dog collar around her neck. With shaking hands, She unclasped the diamonds and left them on the granite vanity. She peeled the midnight blue silk off her body, letting it pool on the floor like an oil slick. She stepped into the shower, turning the water as hot as she could stand it. She scrubbed her skin until it was pink, washing away the smell of cigar smoke, expensive cologne, and fear. When she emerged, she found a stack of folded clothes on the edge of the king-sized bed. A pair of grey sweatpants and a black, long-sleeved thermal shirt. They belonged to Roman. The housekeeper clearly didn't stock women's clothing. She pulled them on. The sweatpants had to be rolled at the waist 3 times, and the sleeves of the thermal hung past her fingertips. She looked ridiculous. She felt infinitely better. She walked back out to the living area. The lights were dimmed. Roman was standing in the open kitchen, leaning against the marble island. He had discarded his tuxedo shirt entirely, wearing only a plain white undershirt and his suit trousers. Without the tailoring, the sheer, dense bulk of his shoulders and arms was impossible to ignore. Scars, pale and jagged, peeked out from the collar of his shirt. He pushed a glass of water and a small white pill across the counter toward her. "Advil," he said. "For the tension headache you're currently hiding." Chloe walked over, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. She picked up the pill and swallowed it dry, following it with a long drink of water. Roman watched her. The tight, severe bun was gone. The ridiculous beige cardigan was gone. The weaponized silk dress was gone. She was standing in his kitchen, drowning in his clothes, her face scrubbed clean of makeup, her dark hair damp and hanging loose over her shoulders. She looked small, vulnerable, completely devastating. "Are you hungry?" he asked, forcing his eyes up to her face. "No." Chloe set the glass down. She wrapped her hands around it, grounding herself against the cold condensation. She stared at the water. "Am I fired?" Roman froze. "What?" "Monday," she said, her voice quiet but remarkably steady. "Am I supposed to come into the office on Monday and pour your coffee at 8:15? Am I supposed to schedule your meetings with the men who are planning to kidnap me tonight?" Roman pushed off the counter. He walked around the island until he was standing just a few feet away from her. "You are not fired. I can't go back to being the invisible fax machine, Roman." The use of his first name slipped out naturally. The boundary had been obliterated the moment he pulled her onto the dance floor. "I know." "So, what happens?" She finally looked up at him. The thick glasses were gone. Her brown eyes were clear, direct, and searching. "You said I can't go home. You said I'm a target. How long does that last? A week? A month? Forever?" Roman didn't have an answer. In the syndicate, memory was long and grudges were permanent. Arthur Penhaligon wouldn't forget the slight. Dominic Russo wouldn't forget the prize he was denied. "It lasts until I make them forget," Roman said softly. "How do you do that?" "I remind them why they should be afraid of me instead of interested in you." The sheer casual brutality of the statement hung in the air between them. Chloe shivered, though the penthouse was perfectly climate-controlled. She was standing in the center of the storm, talking to the hurricane. "Go to sleep, Chloe," Roman said. He lifted a hand, hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently brushing a damp strand of hair away from her face. His knuckles grazed her cheek. The touch was impossibly light for a man who spent his life breaking things. "You're safe here. I'll take the couch." "It's your apartment." "I don't sleep much anyway." He dropped his hand and stepped back, retreating behind his walls. Chloe watched him walk toward the massive leather sofa in the living room. She retreated to the guest room, crawling into the massive, empty bed. The sheets smelled faintly of his soap. She stared at the ceiling, listening to the absolute silence of the reinforced penthouse. She was safe for tonight, but Monday was coming. And the wolves were already at the door. The weekend bled away in a quiet, tense purgatory. The Castellani penthouse became a high-altitude bunker. Roman spent the 48 hours on his encrypted phone, pacing the length of the ballistic windows, speaking in low, clipped Russian and Italian. He was reorganizing security routes. He was pulling favors. He was building a fortress around a 26-year-old woman who sat on his leather sofa, drowning in his spare clothes, watching him orchestrate a shadow war on her behalf. Monday morning arrived with the grey, unforgiving light of an overcast dawn. Chloe stood in this kitchen. She had found a fresh package of coffee beans in the pantry. She ground them, waited exactly 4 minutes, and poured a cup. She carried it into the living room and set it on the glass coffee table in front of Roman, who was slumped on the sofa, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He hadn't slept. He looked at the ceramic mug. Then he looked up at her. "What is this?" he asked, his voice thick with exhaustion. "It's 8:15, Chloe said. She was wearing her own clothes again. One of Roman's men had been dispatched to her apartment on Sunday to pack a suitcase. She wore a pleated grey skirt, a high-collared white blouse, and the heavy tortoiseshell glasses. But the oversized beige cardigan was missing. She had left it in the guest room closet. Roman sat up, the muscles in his back shifting under his thin t-shirt. "You aren't working today." "Yes, I am." "Chloe, be reasonable." "I'm being completely reasonable," she countered, her voice remarkably steady. She crossed her arms over her chest. "If I stay in this penthouse, staring at the walls while you wage war, I will lose my mind. I am not a mob wife. I am not a hostage. I am your executive assistant. You pay me a salary to manage your schedule, and your schedule today includes a logistics meeting with the dock workers' union at 10. Roman stared at her. He saw the tremble in her fingers, quickly hidden as she tucked her hands under her arms. She was terrified, but she was refusing to break. The sheer, stubborn survival instinct radiating from her was something he had entirely underestimated. "If you step off this floor, you are flanked by 2 of my men at all times," Roman said, his tone leaving zero room for negotiation. "You don't go to the lobby alone. You don't go to the restroom alone. If I tell you to get down, you hit the floor. Do we have a deal?" Deal. The return to the 64th floor was a surreal experience. For 2 years, Chloe had walked off the elevator and vanished into the background hum of ringing phones and clacking keyboards. Today, the moment the heavy steel doors parted, the entire floor went dead silent. Dozens of heads snapped up. The junior associates, the enforcers who loitered by the water cooler, the accountants in the corner suites, they all stared. The rumors had already circulated. Everyone knew the boss had taken the invisible secretary to the syndicate Gala. Everyone knew he had nearly crippled a northern underboss over a dance. Chloe felt the weight of their stares, heavy and suffocating. She kept her chin up. She walked straight to her desk outside Roman's massive oak doors, sat down, and booted up her computer. Roman watched her from the doorway of his office. He noted the exact moment she stopped shaking and forced herself into the familiar rhythm of emails and spreadsheets. A strange, heavy knot tightened in his chest. Pride. And an absolute terrifying possessiveness. By 2 p.m, the illusion of normalcy violently shattered. Roman was inside his office on a conference call. Chloe was at her desk sorting through the afternoon mail. The heavy glass doors of the reception area swung open, and 3 men walked in. They bypassed security. The guards at the front desk didn't stop them. They just subtly reached for their holsters and reached for the panic buttons. The man in the center was Victor, Dominic Russo's right-hand lieutenant. He was a broad, ugly man with a flattened nose and a smile that looked like an open wound. Victor didn't look at the guards. He walked directly toward Chloe's desk. The 2 men flanking her, Thomas and Miller, Roman's personal guards, immediately stepped forward, blocking Victor's path. "Easy, boys," Victor said, holding up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just here to deliver a message." He leaned around Thomas, his dead reptilian eyes locking onto Chloe. "Dominic sends his regards, sweetheart. He wanted to know if you enjoyed the gala. He said it was a shame you had to leave so early." Chloe's blood ran cold. The phone in her hand felt like a block of ice. She didn't speak. Victor reached into his jacket. Thomas and Miller drew their weapons instantly. the metallic clatter of slides racking, echoing through the silent office. Victor laughed, a wet, hacking sound. He pulled out a small velvet jewelry box and tossed it onto Chloe's desk. It slid across the wood and hit her keyboard. "Just a gift." Victor smiled. "Dominic hopes you'll wear it next time you see him, and you will see him." The door to the inner office opened. Roman stepped out. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely, lethally blank. He walked up behind Chloe's chair, his hand coming to rest on her shoulder. His grip was warm and solid, anchoring her to the earth. "Victor," Roman said quietly. "Caster. Relax. Just dropping off a token of appreciation from the boss." Roman looked at the velvet box on the desk. He didn't touch it. He looked back up at Victor. "Take it," Roman ordered. Dominic insisted. "I'm not going to repeat myself," Roman said, his voice dropping into a register that made the glass partitions rattle. "Pick up the box, Victor. Walk backward to the elevator. If you ever step onto this floor again, or if you ever speak to her again, I will cut out your tongue and mail it to Dominic in a mason jar." The silence that followed was absolute. Victor looked at the guns pointed at his chest. He looked at the cold, dead certainty in Roman's eyes. Slowly, the mocking smile faded. Victor reached out, snatched the box off the desk, and took a step back. "Message received," Victor muttered. He turned and walked out, his men trailing nervously behind him. Roman didn't move until the elevator doors closed. He looked down at Chloe. She was staring at her monitor, her face paper white, her breathing shallow. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, the violence draining out of him instantly. Chloe closed her eyes and nodded once. The war had officially started, and she was standing right on the front line. By Thursday, the suffocating routine of the Castellani building had become too dangerous to maintain. Roman's intelligence network had flagged unusual movement on the south side. Dominic Russo was moving soldiers. Arthur Penhaligon had gone entirely off the grid. It was the quiet before the hammer dropped. "We need to move your mother," Roman announced, walking into the living area of the penthouse. Chloe looked up from her laptop. She had been trying to pay the monthly bill for the care facility in Queens, the facility where her mother spent 3 days a week, hooked up to a dialysis machine. "Move her? To where?" "I have a private clinic upstate. It's heavily fortified. The doctors are discreet. The staff doesn't ask questions." "Roman, I can't afford a private clinic. It's already paid for," he said flatly, slipping into a dark trench coat. "I made the arrangements yesterday. We're picking her up in 20 minutes. Chloe stood up, the laptop sliding onto the sofa. "You did this without asking me. You can't just uproot her life. She's fragile. She doesn't understand any of this." "What she won't understand is a crew of Arthur's men dragging her out of a public hospital to use as leverage against you," Roman shot back, his patience thinning. "You think they'll play fair, Chloe? They won't. They will find the thing you love most and they will break it just to watch me bleed. Get your coat." The harsh reality of his words shut down her argument instantly. She grabbed her jacket and followed him to the elevator. The drive to the Queen's facility was tense. Roman sat in the back of the armoured SUV, an assault rifle resting on the floorboards between his feet. He was hyper-vigilant, his eyes scanning every overpass, every alleyway they passed. When they arrived at the clinic, Roman insisted on coming inside. Chloe's mother, a frail woman with hollow cheeks and tired eyes, was asleep in her chair, the hum of the dialysis machine filling the sterile room. Chloe sat beside her, gently taking her thin, bruised hand. Roman stood by the door, a massive, dark shadow in the clinical white space. He watched the way Chloe touched her mother. He saw the infinite reservoir of tenderness in her. It was a stark contrast to the brutal, transactional world he operated in. "We have to go," Roman murmured after 10 minutes. "The transport ambulance is waiting out back." They managed the transfer quickly. Her mother, groggy and confused, was loaded into a secure, unmarked medical transport, flanked by 2 of Roman's heavily armed SUVs. Chloe watched the ambulance pull away, heading north towards safety. A massive weight lifted off her chest, instantly replaced by a deep, hollow guilt. Roman was paying for this. He was saving her family. The debt she owed him was now astronomical. "She'll be safe there," Roman said, opening the door to his own SUV for her. "Thank you," she whispered, stepping inside. The ambush happened 3 blocks away from the hospital. They were waiting at a red light beneath a rusting elevated train track. The street was suspiciously empty. Roman noticed the lack of traffic a split second before a black, reinforced van slammed violently into the side of their SUV. The impact threw Chloe sideways. Her head struck the leather seat with a sickening crack. The world spun into a blur of shattering glass and screeching metal. "Down!" Roman roared, grabbing her by the collar of her jacket and shoving her violently to the floorboards. Gunfire erupted. It wasn't the scattered popping of handguns. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of automatic weapons. The ballistic glass of the SUV spiderwebbed instantly, absorbing the impacts but holding firm. "Drive!" Roman shouted at Miller, who was bleeding from a deep gash on his forehead. Miller jammed the transmission into reverse, flooring the accelerator. The SUV tires screamed, burning rubber as they tore backward away from the van. But another vehicle, a heavy pickup truck, swung out from a side street, blocking their escape. They were boxed in. Men in tactical gear began pouring out of the van. They weren't aiming for Roman's side of the car. They were swarming toward the rear passenger door. Toward Chloe. Roman understood the play instantly. It wasn't an assassination. It was an extraction. The cold, logistical boss vanished. The monster took over. Roman kicked his door open before the SUV had even fully stopped moving. He didn't bother with the rifle. There was no room for it in the tight space. He drew his sidearm. Chloe lay curled on the floorboards. Her hands clamped over her ears, screaming. The noise was deafening. She watched through the open door as Roman stepped directly into the line of fire. He didn't flinch. He didn't seek cover. He moved with a terrifying mechanical efficiency. 2 shots. A man in tactical gear dropped. 1 step forward, another shot. A second man collapsed against the hood of the van. A third man rushed him from the blind spot. Roman didn't even turn fully. He simply pivoted, grabbed the man's weapon by the barrel, forced it upward, and fired a single round point blank into the attacker's chest. The man crumpled. It was over in less than 15 seconds. 4 men lay dead on the asphalt. The remaining attackers piled back into the pickup truck, the driver realizing the target was heavily defended, and tore off down the street. Silence rushed back in, broken only by the hiss of a ruptured radiator and the distant wail of sirens. Roman turned back to the SUV. His suit jacket was torn. A streak of blood, not his own, splattered across his white shirt. He leaned into the back seat, his chest heaving, his eyes wild and completely dilated. He reached down, gripping Chloe by the arms, and hauled her up from the floorboards. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands frantically checking her shoulders, her neck, her torso. "Did they hit you?" "No," she gasped, her whole body shaking violently. "No, I'm okay. I'm okay." Roman stopped checking. He pulled her flush against his chest, wrapping his arms around her with bone-crushing force. He buried his face in her hair, his breathing ragged and harsh against her ear. It wasn't a professional embrace. It was the desperate, possessive grip of a man who had just realized he would burn the entire city to the ground before he let anyone take her. Chloe clung to his ruined, bloody shirt, squeezing her eyes shut. She was terrified of the violence, but she was far more terrified of the fact that, in his arms, surrounded by death, she had never felt safer in her entire life. The drive back to the Castellani Tower was a blur of flashing sirens and calculated silence. The police had been delayed by strategic 911 calls made by Roman's network, buying them the 3 minutes they needed to vanish from the ambush site. When the elevator finally sealed them inside the 65th floor, the adrenaline crash hit Chloe like a freight train. Her knees buckled. Roman caught her before she hit the slate tiles. He didn't say a word. He just scooped her up into his arms, carrying her through the sterile foyer and laying her gently on the massive leather sofa in the living room. The penthouse was dead quiet, save for the hum of the climate control. Roman stepped back. He stripped off the ruined, blood-spattered suit jacket and threw it onto the floor. He unbuttoned his collar, revealing the angry red line of a fresh graze across his collarbone. He wasn't looking at her. He was pacing the length of the ballistic windows, a cell phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, terrifying monotone. I want the docks locked down. I want every warehouse belonging to Rousseau burned to the foundation. If Arthur Penhaligon tries to leave the city, you put him in the trunk of a car and you bring him to me. No exceptions. We are done playing defense. He ended the call and tossed the phone onto the kitchen island. Chloe sat up slowly. Her head throbbed where it had struck the window, but the physical pain was secondary to the massive, undeniable shift in the room. The invisible wall between them, the wall constructed of beige sweaters, strict itineraries, and the sterile boundaries of employment, was gone. It had burned up in the crossfire on that street in Queens. Roman walked into his bedroom. He emerged 5 minutes later wearing a black tactical shirt and dark cargo pants, strapping a heavy leather shoulder holster over his chest. He was gearing up for a war. "Where are you going?" Chloe asked. Her voice was weak, but the tremble was gone. Roman stopped checking the magazine of his sidearm. He looked at her, his eyes dark and utterly devoid of mercy. "I told you I was going to make them forget. That timeline just moved up. You're going after Dominic tonight. I'm going after all of them tonight." He shoved the spare magazine into his pocket. They broke the truce. They came for a civilian in broad daylight. If I let the sun rise without putting Dominic in the ground, the rest of the families will think I'm weak. They'll never stop coming for you. It was the cold, geographical truth of his reality. There were no police to call. There was no court of law. There was only blood and the brutal arithmetic of survival. Chloe stood up. Her legs were unsteady, but she forced herself to walk across the room. She didn't stop a polite 3 feet away. She stepped directly into his space, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his chest. She reached up. Her hands were small against the broad, Kevlar-lined expanse of his chest. She grabbed the collar of his tactical shirt. "Kill them," she whispered. Roman froze. The breath hitched in his throat. This woman, who apologized when she set a coffee cup down too hard, who hid from the world in oversized cardigans, was looking him dead in the eye and demanding a slaughter. "They tried to take me. They would have used me to get to you," she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, ragged register. "So kill them, and then come back here." Roman looked down at her. The last vestiges of the boss vanished, leaving only a man completely, terrifyingly obsessed. He cupped her face in his large calloused hands, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones. "I will always come back," he vowed. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was a violent, desperate collision of teeth and heat, fueled by the sheer terror of almost losing her. Chloe kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands tangling in his dark hair. She tasted scotch, copper, and absolute certainty. When he finally pulled away, they were both breathing heavily. Roman pressed his forehead against hers for a fleeting second. Then he turned and walked onto the elevator. The doors slid shut. The waiting was a unique kind of torture. Chloe sat on the edge of the sofa, watching the digital clock on the oven tick past midnight, then 2 in the morning, then 4. She didn't turn on the television. She didn't sleep. She sat in the dark, staring at the steel doors of the elevator, praying to a god she hadn't spoken to in years. At 5:14 a.m., the retinal scanner clicked. The heavy steel doors parted. Roman stepped out. He looked like a man who had walked through hell. His face was smeared with ash and soot. His knuckles were split and bleeding freely. He moved with a heavy, agonizing limp. He walked into the kitchen and dropped something small and metallic onto the marble island. It was a heavy gold signet ring, Dominic Rousseau's ring. The threat was permanently neutralized. Chloe stood up. She walked into the bathroom, grabbed a wet washcloth and the first aid kit, and returned to the kitchen. Roman had slumped onto one of the bar stools, staring blankly at the wall. She stood between his knees. She took his heavy, bruised hand in hers and began to wipe the blood from his knuckles. He winced, but didn't pull away. He just looked at her. "I'm going to need a new secretary, aren't I?" Roman murmured, his voice a raspy whisper. Chloe carefully applied an antiseptic patch to a deep cut on his palm. She didn't look up. "I don't think HR would approve of this dynamic, no." "Good." Roman reached out with his uninjured hand, gripping her waist and pulling her closer until her stomach brushed against his chest. "I hated the beige sweaters anyway." Chloe finally looked at him. The exhaustion in his eyes was absolute, but beneath it was a profound, unshakable peace. The joke was over. The game was finished. He had pulled her out of the shadows, and she had decided she liked the light. "I know," she smiled, dropping the bloody washcloth into the sink. "They were awful." She leaned down, burying her face in the curve of his neck, breathing in the smell of smoke, gunpowder, and the man who had burned down the city just to keep her safe. What started as a cynical joke turned into a full-blown war, proving that love and obsession can completely rewrite the rules of the underworld. Roman took the ultimate risk by pulling Chloe out of the shadows, and in the end, it was her quiet strength that anchored his chaotic world. Did you love this intense, slow-burn shift from invisible assistant to mafia queen? Hit that like button if Roman's ruthless devotion gave you chills. Don't forget to share this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below telling us your favorite moment. See you next time.